Denied a Mummy is a brilliant read. This is a foster care memoir from Maggie Hartley. This was released originally in 2018, and I've just read it for the second time, and I have to say it's so gripping. It's so fascinating, and for anybody who thinks that foster carers just look after children for the money and it's an easy way to get some extra income, read this book because I don't think anybody would want to go into fostering after reading this. Hopefully, if they stick with it, they'll see just how rewarding it can be. But it certainly highlights that looking after children, depending on the children, can be incredibly challenging because Maggie looks after these three children, Mary, Sean, and Dougie. And if I remember their ages correctly, I think Mary's 8, Sean's 7, and I think Dougie was 5. Apologies if that's not 100% accurate. But what's really interesting is that they've never been to school. And basically, their parents kept moving them around the country. They were found one day when there was a drugs raid in their home, and I use the word home there lightly. And basically, the children were living in squalor, and there was just feces everywhere, urine everywhere, absolutely horrible, and the children were wild. They'd obviously never been given boundaries because they were completely neglected. It's also possible that they suffered abuse, not necessarily physically, but they saw some things that they definitely shouldn't have seen as children, which suggests a level of, maybe emotional and mental abuse, and they are just unruly, to put it mildly, and they defecate all over the floor. Certainly the two boys, and some of the things they do, I couldn't imagine having to deal with that on a regular basis, because it's not as if they come into care and then, day one they're wild, day two they start obeying the rules. That's completely not how it works. And Maggie really had her hands full, and obviously it's really nice to read as we see them starting to make progress, and over time Maggie's efforts starting to sink in with the children. But it's not as if it's a quick fix, and hats off to Maggie Hartley and any other foster carer who looks after children in similar situations, because it's shocking to read, quite frankly. And obviously it's horrible to think of what they've witnessed and what they've had to go through, but also how it's affected them mentally, how it's affected their behaviours. And had Maggie not been there, had social services not intervened when they did, who knows what kind of future they would have had. Of course, because they're older children, it's not clear what the care plan for them will be going forward. Obviously, to begin with, nobody can think about putting a care plan in place because there's no way they could be adopted, they couldn't be fostered long term, not until they, quite frankly, learn to exist in society, as harsh as that sounds. This is the level of damage that these children have faced. And what's really interesting is that about halfway through the book, it seems like things are starting to wrap up. And I was surprised to realize I still had a good 40%, 50% of the book. I read the Kindle version, and needless to say, things don't go to plan, and things are not plain sailing, and there are concerns about their future. And I don't want to say any more than that, but what I will say is that it's very gripping. It's one of those books that I just didn't want to put down. Every chapter was shocking. Sometimes they were heartwarming. It was really lovely to see the children making strides, making positive improvements. But then something else would happen that would throw a spanner in the works, as it were. Generally, it's a very well written book. There are a couple of grammatical errors. The phrase kettle of fish was used far too many times, and a few other small things here and there, but not enough for me to say it's badly written. Absolutely not at all. So definitely one that I recommend. It's kind of a good entry level foster care memoir insofar as, yes, the neglect and the abuse is horrific, but it's not overly graphic. It depends on what you consider graphic, but compared to some, it's a good example of how bad things can be, but it's still readable. It's not one where I felt the need to cry all the way through it, where occasionally that does happen. So if you've never read any foster care memoir or any of Maggie Hartley's, it's a pretty powerful place to start. It isn't the tamest, but I also feel like you won't want to put it down. So, in that sense, it is a really good introduction. Either way, wherever you are with your reading journey with foster care memoirs, I definitely recommend Denied a Mummy. It's very well written insofar as it's captivating, it's fascinating, it's heartbreaking as well, and really helps to highlight the challenges that foster carers face because. As we often see in foster care memoirs, some parents, of children in care say that they just do it for the money. They're only looking after their children because of the money they get. When it's obvious that foster carers don't exactly get a lot of money, and when they have to deal with children like this, if they were only doing it for the money, I feel like there would be no amount of money. It's definitely one of those books where that becomes very clear. So, for the right reasons, I thoroughly recommend it. Denied a Mummy is a very powerful book that's definitely worth reading.